I'm not actually a lawyer, because everything else you said is correct. I should have worn black to be a lawyer today. So we've heard a lot about reputation, and I do spend my life helping universities think about their reputations and helping them understand what reputations they have. Because, as we know, reputation is really what the public thinks of the university. So we might be able to manage our reputation and try and control it, but ultimately, reputation is formed by third parties, by other people. So, as a World 100 Reputation Network, we try to understand a different area of reputation every year. So we've done previous studies, a little bit referring to the study we heard yesterday about the impact of rankings. That was one of our first projects. We also, a couple of years ago, looked at motivations for international academics to change universities and what for them constituted reputation, which was fascinating. And last year we did a very big study, which I'm going to talk to you about, and hopefully, if it works, show you some film footage of some PhD, so doctoral students, talking about what factors were really important to them when they chose where to study. So these are very bright young people who are probably wanting to be an academic or perhaps use their PhD to get a top job. So it's sort of divided between those two rationales. And we interviewed in 12 different countries, about 100 students face-to-face, and we also did a quantitative study so that we attracted a further, I think about 600 students to answer questions online. So we had a lot of evidence, but before we really sort of finalised what the questions were, we actually did some filming of the students, which I want to share with you. And the reason for that was, well, partly for exactly this, so that at conferences we get to really show how they make decisions, because the problem with just showing you facts is that you sort of don't capture the sort of multi-layered decision-making that really constitutes reputation. So that was one of the reasons we wanted to film them. Another reason was so that we could really be clear, had we asked the right questions, were any of the questions leading, did they understand the tasks, and so the members of our network were able to sort of think about that, comment, and feedback changes. So it was a good process for being clear. What we didn't do is film every single student we interviewed, so I just want to make that clear to you. It was only the first stage of interviews, so, and they all knew that they were being filmed and gave us permission. So just to start with, how do they choose a top university? We constructed an exercise which just asked them to place factors in two groups. These were important, these were less important. And that didn't work, because what became apparent was that the decision-making process is really like a journey. So it's like climbing this mountain. And at the bottom of the mountain, various things are important to you. Have you got the right guide? You've measured your kit? Have you said goodbye to your family? When you get to the top of the mountain, it might be much more important to think about your equipment, your food, your sleeping bag, etc. So there are different priorities at different stages, and it doesn't mean one is sort of less important than another. So what we did instead was create this sort of pyramid, and they put factors into essentials, which were the things that every university they considered had to have. So you might call that a hygiene factor. It's not quite a hygiene factor. That's why we stuck to the term essentials, things that were really important, but they weren't going to be decisive at the very top. Attractions were the sort of nice-to-haves, which tended to be more environmental, so campus and pleasant city and so on. And then the shortlisting, we were asking them to think about the really critical factors that set a couple of universities apart for them to make those final choices about where to apply for PhD. And then that final, the sort of peak of the mountain is the deciding factor, so what really, really mattered to them. So I'm going to just play you the first
When I
film.
reviewed to apply for my PhD, I wanted to do green chemistry, and I found people working in United States, in France, and in the UK. And I said, okay, well, I don't like United States because there are many problems between Mexicans and people from United States, and I felt that I'm not going to feel comfortable knowing what's going on in the political stuff with my country and that country. And I said, no, I'm not going to apply to United States. France was the second one, but in science, and I said English is the communication language, so I'm going to go for going to the UK. And after, well, that bits of university and department, they were not so important for me because I said I want to work with this guy. That is the best one.
Wherever he was.
And he was, yeah.
Okay, so that was Cynthia, who came from quite a disadvantaged family in Mexico, incredibly bright. You could hear her decision-making. So she'd thought about the countries. She said she wasn't comfortable as a Mexican being in the US. She'd thought about France, but she recognized that English was the language of knowledge and of science. That was her way of putting it. And she then focused on the UK. And when she thought about the UK, her subject was green chemistry. She found the very best person who was teaching green chemistry, and she wanted to be his doctoral student. So, you know, all sorts of interesting processes going on, and that's how she finally made her deciding journey. We asked the students when they used the word reputation what they meant by it. And within that sort of pyramid, we gave them factors which were both quality and reputation, so that they could choose between them and decide which was the most important. And they were very clear that quality was different to reputation, which we thought was fascinating. Because often quality, and it was used yesterday, is described as being reputation. And they saw them as both very important factors. So reputation, they're very clear, is what the public understand about that university. And they see that as, sometimes they use the word brand, sometimes they use the word communications, sometimes they use the word marketing, but it's the visibility of the university. So if you take, for example, a famous wine, has that wine been heard of? Is that label recognized? Is it understood? And then the quality is the internal perception of that wine, the taste, the flavor, only recognizable to the connoisseur. And in a way, they saw themselves as the connoisseur. So they felt that as a PhD student, they could determine the quality, but their parents couldn't, or their friends couldn't. Their friends and their parents would know about reputation, so the label of the wine, was it known? Was that university known on the other side of the world? So they were very clear about that. And both are important. They want to go to a university that is known, that is understood, that has strong communications and marketing. But for their journey, for their PhD, the quality has to be there. So they want both. They're very clear about that. The pyramid, I explained, these are the factors that matter to them. So you've got the deciding is the bright green. I'm not sure how well you can see that. I'll put the arrow on it. So the bright green is the final deciding most important factor. So here you can see we've aggregated all of them. So the essentials are the purple, and then the attractions are the sort of pale lilac, and then the shortlisting are the blue, and then the bright green is the deciding. So
all of them are important in a way. You could argue that the essentials are just as important as the deciding, because if you don't have the essentials right, they're not even going to consider you. You could argue that the attractions are not very important, but often the attractions, when people talked about them, you could see that they really did matter. So sometimes that sense of beautiful campus had really been important to them. And sometimes they would put the attractions, move them into the deciding factor as well. So they were able to move the factors up to the top. But overall, you can see that the winner is supervisor, which one would hope, in a way, is what would persuade a PhD student to study a PhD at a particular university. And that, of course, means that that supervisor needs to amplify their reputation in order for those PhD students to know about him or her. So that is all about getting their message out, their story, through the media, through conferences, through face-to-face meetings with PhD students, or good online communications. Very close to that, then, is reputation. So reputation is almost, reputation of the university is almost as important as quality supervisor. And then below that is quality university. So if we had aggregated the quality and the reputation, you could see that would have been by far the most important factor. But we were separating them out because the students themselves mentally separated those out. Other important things, good academic facilities, very important. A lot of these students are using MRI scanners, are medics. You know, the quality of the environment, like this beautiful museum we're in today, the quality of the environment resonates with PhD students, and it gives them these visual signals that they're going to be cared for and they're going to have the equipment they need for doctoral work. And then funding and scholarships is also really important, but you can see that tends to be important at the first stage. So that's much more about the essentials, and by the very end, is slightly less important, because by then they've already decided that they're applying to universities that would offer them funding and scholarships. On that note, it's important to say that even very affluent students are looking for funding and scholarships, because for them it's a sign of prestige. So even if they don't really need the money, they still said they would be looking actively for funded places. Okay, do students use rankings? We wanted to see what was the most important information source for finding out about the factors on the previous slide. So how did they find out about choice factors? Which source of information was most useful? So we gave them this selection, and they were also invited to add any others that we'd forgotten. And the thing that came out at the top was rankings. Quite clearly, rankings was the #1 information source for making choices about where to study. I think it's quite interesting that websites also comes up really highly. So that means your university's website is almost as important as the rankings. So if one thinks about rankings as the sort of factual data metric, then the website is much more the communications marketing tool, the tool that you have in your own hands to persuade students of the virtues, the excitement, the wonderful scholars. In a way, that's really empowering to think that you can influence doctoral student choices by having a really persuasive and excellent website. And you can see the other factors streaming down from there. Important, but rankings and website the most. We then did, within this interview, which each interview took about an hour, so it's a long sort of detailed interview, we did an exercise to see what their view of rankings was. But what we asked them to do is order these universities. So we asked them to order them by reputation. So we didn't ask them to put them in the order of the world ranking. We asked them to put them in their personal order of reputation. And that's the order they put them in. And what I've done is I put the Times Higher ranking next to it. And what we can see is that their order is almost identical to the student ranking. So it's very, very similar. So Oxford and MIT are right at the top. And then you've got ETH, Zurich, and Toronto. They've kind of switched positions, but only slightly. Tokyo, the same. Melbourne, the same, and so on. So they had, in effect, a very strong understanding of ranking. So we gave them, based on their aggregate responses, we gave them a score combining their responses of validity. So 10 means that they had a perfect understanding of the ranked position. And the ones in red are the ones where they didn't quite get the same high score. So they felt Copenhagen was higher than it was, and they felt Pohang was lower than it was. They didn't know where Pohang was. Pohang, I'm sure you'll know, is a very new university in South Korea. So the fact that it's new meant they didn't know it, and the fact that it's quite a specialist institution probably also meant that unless they were in science and engineering, they also didn't know it. But generally, the picture means that students have a very strong mental understanding of where their institution, where universities are ranked. We then ask them to score their own university. So they have that ladder of all those universities, and we asked all of them to put their own university in order. So they could insert their university on a card anywhere within that ladder. And what was really interesting is that they nearly always put their own university third. So however high or low ranked their university was, their perception of their own university is that it's really high, and it's always sort of about third in this list of universities. And what was fascinating is we did this exercise about 3 years ago with academics, and they did exactly the same thing. So what that means is that, the good news is that academics and your doctoral students love you, and they think that you're fantastic. And they actually have an inflated sense of your ranking. They have a razor-sharp sense of everyone else's ranking, and they have an inflated sense of their own ranking, which really at the end of the day means that they are one of your best ambassadors, which is good news if you use them properly. So there we go. Most students are highly aspirational in their reputational positioning of their own university. So let's move on. Brand. We had a brand question, and in the pilot study, the filming I'm showing you, we asked about brand, and I'm going to show you a student talking about brand in a minute. And when I showed that to the network, they said, you need to be clearer to see if they understand brand before you ask them about university brand. So in the real interviews, after the pilot, we added a question, and we said, what is your favorite brand? Can be anything. Shoes, coffee, hot chocolate, whatever. And they were brilliant at it. And I sat there listening about Nike trainers. Probably spent, if I added it all up, several hours listening about Nike trainers. Or their Samsung phone, or their iPhone. It tended to be around sports apparel and phones. Fair enough. So they were able to ascribe character to their phone and their computer and their shoes or their jeans or their, I had one PhD student telling me about Estee Lauder lipstick. It has a character. That's fine. They were really clear. They understood what brand is, and it was not simply the graphic identity. It was the quality, the character, the distinctive factor that made them purchase this product instead of that product. When it came to their university, they stumbled. They couldn't do it. So I'll just show you if it's working. This is one of the students in the pilot study talking about York University.
How is York different as a university from other universities?
Okay.
What makes it distinctive? Does it have a brand?
I don't know how to answer this because I don't see universities as a brand, but like when the university has got its reputation, you know, for its teaching, for producing really good students, like sort of like good employability in terms of all that. So I think York had a very good reputation in the rankings for teaching, and I think particularly for teaching, I think there were like really good opinions about students about York. So I think in that terms, I would say it's very Christian. But apart from that, I'm really like sort of stuck how to answer that.
Do you feel it's internationally well known in other countries?
I think it's really well known in China. I think we have like our own like ceremony, like graduation ceremony in China, so it's quite famous there. I think still like there are a few places in India where it's not really famous. Like in my case, I was lucky that I had some friends who had studied here and had known about this university. But before that, I sort of like didn't really hear much about the University of York. I only heard like about Cambridge and Stanford and Yale. And I think so. I'm not aware of like my other friends telling me about like York being really famous in Nigeria, or like in Turkey or something. And they all had to like go to the list of rankings and had to like sort of like look at it. So I think it has to be more promoted in such countries to be like, sort of get more attention.
Okay, so as you can see, we spent a long time letting them think about that. It wasn't a rushed question. We tried to approach it in different ways. But that was a very typical response. A lot of pausing, a lot of uncertainty. When they did try to answer it, it was often referring again to ranked position or awareness in other countries, which perhaps comes back to definitions of reputation, so public amplification and ranked position. So what it seems is that these students are not really very articulate about explaining the strengths of their own university, the character of their own university. And given that these students are probably some of the best ambassadors of the university, they don't seem to have the toolkit, the story, to sell it on very well. So it seems a bit of a missed opportunity. And British universities, whilst perhaps they pride themselves on being really strong in many aspects of reputation management, I think perhaps like Spanish universities realize that they need to do a lot more on distinctiveness, unique selling points, and also just being able to tell a story. And perhaps that's because they themselves are not sufficiently involved in the brand story. And perhaps if they were, they would be much better at explaining it. If anybody knows York, it has a great story. And it has a great location, you know, a medieval location, Roman remains. It has a fantastic new campus, and we knew it has these highlight subjects like green chemistry and literature that didn't come out at all in the brand question. And that was exactly the same for every other university that we spoke to. Okay, let's move on. Most of the time, these PhD students were really happy with the experience, but there were a few things when they were disappointed that they would then dwell on.
So probably at the top of that list is supervisor. And some students hadn't yet been allocated a supervisor. That seemed to be common in America. So they didn't know who they were going to be supervised by. It seems to be more like an apprenticeship scheme in America. So you work for a professor, and if he decides he wants to engage you and he has the funds, he'll offer you a PhD position after a year or so. But often they don't. So PhD students often feel a bit used by that experience. Other European students felt their supervisors weren't sufficiently engaged with them. Those that were very famous often weren't around. So it was a case of, oh, they're always at a conference or they're too busy writing their book. So there was some criticism of supervisors, but actually, on the whole, most people really had a very good relationship with the supervisor. I think the physical space is really important too. So you can see that poor accommodation was often cited. They didn't like being housed with undergraduate students, or certainly in London, they found it very difficult if they had to commute a long way to get to the university. And London is really expensive. We had the same issue in Tokyo. Students were living an hour from the university where they could afford accommodation, having to come in. And whilst that might be acceptable for workers like you and me, it wasn't really acceptable to PhD students who were often in the lab till 10 o'clock at night. So they didn't want an hour's journey. Other minor things there, they didn't feel that often the university had created a PhD experience. It was too focused on the undergraduate experience. They wanted to be looked after slightly differently to the younger undergraduates. And those universities that had invested the money in a graduate school, I'm not sure if Navarra has a graduate school, the PhD students were likely to be much happier. We also asked about international experience, and bear in mind these students were all international. I perhaps didn't mention that at the beginning. They're all international PhD students, so they're all studying outside their home country. So they're very aware of whether the campus environment is indeed international. And they did pick up on the fact that there were not enough international students sometimes, or that the staff weren't international. So that they're very aware of that. They're also, we found that very few of them were offered experiences to study abroad as part of their PhD. It was happening in Scandinavia more than anywhere else, I think. But very few other countries were able to offer a term abroad, for example. Which might be complicated to organise, but we could see that that would have added a huge amount of value to the PhD experience. So, how can universities, bearing in mind these things, articulate reputation in ways that PhD students value? So what are the lessons that this study shows us? That's Doctor Who, by the way, on the left. I don't know if you know Doctor Who in Spain. He's the ultimate PhD supervisor. So number one, reputation and quality are so important that you've got to, if you've got it, amplify that to your students, because that is the number one thing they'll choose you on. Supervisor is, in that choice decision, was right at the top. So they are absolutely critical. They need to be out and about at conferences. They need to be really good at their verbal skills. They need to be able to tell the brand story. I showed you an example of a PhD student failing to really tell the brand story of York University. I would imagine academics at York University might have been similarly tongue-tied. Other people are really important endorsers as well, so alumni and staff, same thing. Rankings, I'm afraid, are important, and I've shown you why. The good news is, if you're not very well ranked, is that your website is massively persuasive. So if you can convince in other ways that demonstrate quality, That might be your community engagement, it might be your creative spirit, it might be the buildings, the facilities, the culture. Then you need to really showcase those on your website because that's what students are using. Number 9 down there on that list, integrated research, was also really important. That was an additional factor we added after the pilot stage when students started to talk about their desire to study somewhere where the research was integrated and collaborative. So they didn't want to be stuck in a study on their own without access to other departments. A lot of students are working across different areas. So if they were doing physics, they wanted access to the chemistry department. If they were doing law, they might have wanted access to the medical department because they might have been doing some aspect of medical negligence. So the integration of university departments seems to be really important for these young people. Okay, so those are my findings. I'm just putting a plug for the conference we're having in Sydney in Australia if you're interested in the research we're doing. I hope that shows you some of the things that you as a university need to think about with reputation and how you can amplify it and what these students value. And I think all of it is a useful reminder that reputation is about what other people think of us. We can try and control that, and we can try and project what they want us to think of, but ultimately, unless you do that kind of testing, unless you do those audits and those questions, you will never really know what people think of your university. So there we go. Thank you very much.